So the second premise of the argument is that while my ideas are only known to have an equal amount of actual reality as one another, so any one of my ideas is just as real as any other as an idea, okay? Doesn't mean that they really exist outside my mind, but in my mind, I know that any idea I have, it just has as much reality as it has as an idea. I know that much, okay? And so all of my ideas are equivalent or equal in that way. But the contents of my ideas have varying degrees of apparent reality. So some of my ideas seem less real than others of my ideas, or some of my ideas seem they seem to correspond less to an external reality than others of my ideas do. So some of my ideas appear to me to be something like illusions or optical illusions or kind of momentary hallucinations or tricks of the eye or of the senses. They seem that way. Like if I close my eyes and push on my eyelids, then I may see some colors, but I don't think that those colors correspond to real objects outside of my perceptual apparatus. So the ideas that I have of those colors I see when I press on my eyelids, that idea, the sort of content of those ideas, seems less real to me than the content of my idea of the table that I'm sitting at, for instance, which seems very real, okay? Now, the way that Descartes expresses this is a bit confusing because he uses an old-fashioned terminology. For things that have actual reality, he uses the term formal reality. This is called formal reality because it means the reality of a form in the Aristotelian sense, which means something that actually takes up space, that has a shape, okay? So by formal reality, he means something that has a form, that takes up space in some way, which means something that really exists. By objective reality, he means the reality of something as an object of thought. So that's what I've called in premise 2 the contents of my ideas, okay? So the reality of the contents of my ideas, or the apparent reality of the contents of my ideas. This is what Descartes calls objective reality. Doesn't mean objective the way we use the word objective to mean like a physical object, or objective meaning standing outside of or apart from the subject. He means objective in the sense of it's an object of thought. And again, this is an old-fashioned terminology, so it's a little bit tricky to follow, but you need to remember this when you're reading Meditation 3, or else you'll get confused and you won't be able to read it accurately. That when he uses the term objective reality, this is what he means. He means reality as an object of thought, and the objective reality of things says only something about their content, the contents of the ideas. It doesn't say anything directly about what exists outside of us. Okay, so the objective reality is something that exists really just, it's something that characterizes really just the ideas in our own mind, which again is confusing because we normally think of objective as opposed to subjective. Today we think of it that way, but that's not what Descartes meant. He meant objective as something that is being approached as an object by us, which means it's something as thought by us. Descartes gives two examples pretty quickly, sort of in passing in just a few sentences, of this distinction in degrees of objective reality of our ideas. So again, this is degrees in the apparent reality of the contents of our ideas. He says ideas of substance have more objective reality than ideas of accidents and modes. Accidents are things like what Aristotle described as basically qualities and quantities that apply to substances that are non-essential. So non-essential qualities and properties all basically quality, quantity, and so on. As long as they're non-essential, those are accidents. And modes is something else like that. So basically, he means here the ideas of like substantive things have more objective reality than the ideas of adjectives that describe those things or descriptors that describe those things. Somehow, and sort of the idea is like, rabbit has more objective reality. The idea of a rabbit has more objective reality than the idea of the whiteness of the rabbit or the spot of black fur on the rabbit. Okay. And Descartes says, my idea of God has more objective reality than nearly, I don't know if he says nearly, but than anything else. Okay. Either anything else or nearly anything else. Why is that? Well, what does Descartes think about God? What is my idea of God? When he says my idea of God, what does he mean? He means the idea of an all-powerful, all-good being that created all of the known universe. Okay. Now, that being, he says in passing, the idea of that being, okay, that idea, the content of that idea, has a whole lot of objective reality, because that being that my idea is supposedly of, the content of that idea is of a being who is responsible for the existence of everything else. So if it weren't for that being, nothing else would exist. The same kinds of arguments that Aristotle used to argue that primary substance must be the most real kind of thing, medieval philosophers used to argue that God must be the most real kind of thing, because if it weren't for God, even substances wouldn't exist. So Descartes is drawing on that same kind of reasoning here to say that God, that idea of God, has more objective reality than nearly anything else. That God is in a way, because God is the idea of God is the idea of something that's the source of everything else that's real, then the idea of God is the idea of something that is more real than everything else. If God is the source of all real things, then God must also be more real than everything else.